During the mid-4th century, the history of the Church walked apace with the history of the Roman Empire. With the death of Constantine the Great, the rule of the empire devolved to his three sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius. In the power-hungry maneuverings that followed, they did their upbringing in a Christian education little honor. They quickly and brutally removed any challenge by their father's relatives, and then they set to work on one another. 3 years after Constantine's death, they went to war with each other in a struggle for supremacy. Constantine II was slain by his brother Constans, who was in turn murdered by a Gallic commander of the imperial guard named Magnentius. After the defeat and suicide of Magnentius, Constantius became the sole emperor and reigned until his death in 361. Constantius departed from his father Constantine's policy of religious toleration. Constantius was greatly influenced by that Arian bishop of Constantinople, Eusebius, whom we've already encountered in previous episodes. He inspired Constantius to use his authority as emperor to enforce Arianism, not only on pagans of the empire, but also on the Orthodox Nicaean Christians. Paganism was violently suppressed. Their temples were pillaged and destroyed, with the loot taken from them given either to the church or Constantius's political cronies. As Christians had earlier been subject to arrest and execution, so now pagans were. Not unexpectedly, large numbers of them came over to the faith. Their conversion, of course, feigned. A similar persecution was applied to Nicaean Christians. They were punished with confiscation of their property, and many times they were banished. Constantius meddled in many church affairs, which during his reign was fraught with doctrinal controversy. He called a multitude of councils. He called some in Gaul and Italy, Illyricum, Asia. He fancied himself something of an accomplished theologian and enjoyed being called Bishop of the Bishops. Now, Constantius justified his violent suppression of paganism by likening it to God's command that Israel wipe out the idol-worshipping Canaanites. However, intelligent church leaders like Athanasius argued for toleration. Athanasius wrote this, quote, "Satan, because there is no truth in him, breaks in with axe and sword. But the Savior is gentle and forces no one to whom he comes, but knocks on and speaks to the soul. Open to me, my sister. If we open to him, he enters, but if we will not, he departs. For truth is not preached by sword and dungeon, by the might of an army, but by persuasion and exhortation. How can there be persuasion where the fear of the emperor is uppermost, or exhortation where the contradictory has to expect banishment and death?" Unquote. The ever-swinging pendulum of history foretells that the forced upon faith propagated by Constantius will provoke a pagan reaction. And that reaction came immediately after Constantius during the reign of his cousin, Julian the Apostate. Julian only avoided the earlier purge of his family by Constantine and his sons because, well, at the time he was too young to pose a threat. But the young, as they say, grow up. Julian had received a Christian education. He was being trained for a position in church leadership. But he nurtured a secret hatred for the religion of the court, a religion under which his family had been exterminated. He studied the banned texts of Eastern mystics and Greek philosophers, all the more thrilling because they were forbidden. Julian became so immersed in paganism that he was made the leader of a secret order devoted to keeping the ancient religion alive. Despite his hostility towards Christianity, Julian recognized the faith was too deeply entrenched to turn back the sundial to a time when Christians were persona non grata. When he became emperor, he decided instead to pry loose the influence that they had established in the civil realm. So he appointed pagans to important posts and reclaimed some of the pagan temples that had been turned into churches, reverting them to their original use. Julian enacted a policy of religious tolerance. Everyone, he said, was free to practice whatever faith they wanted. Now, make no mistake, Julian wanted to eliminate Christianity. It's just that he felt the best way to accomplish that wasn't by attacking it outright. After all, 200 years of persecution had already shown persecution of Christians wasn't effective. Rather, Julian figured all the various sects of Christianity would go to war with one another, and the movement would die the death of 1,000 cuts, all of them self-inflicted. Now, his plan didn't work out, of course, but it was an astute observation of how factious the followers of Christ can be. When Julian was killed in 363 in an ill-advised war against the Sassanids, who were the successors to the Parthians, the pagan revival that he'd hoped for fizzled. And the reasons for its demise were many. Because paganism is an amalgam of contradictory beliefs and worldviews, it lacked the cohesion that's needed to stare down Christianity. And compared to the virtuous morality and ethical priorities of Christianity, paganism just paled in comparison. Julian's hope for elimination of Christianity by allowing its various sects to operate side by side never materialized. On the contrary, major advances were made toward a mutual understanding of the doctrinal debates that had divided them. The old Athanasius was still around, and as an elder statesman for the church, he'd mellowed, making him a rallying point for different groups. He called a gathering of church leaders in Alexandria in 362, right in the middle of Julian's reign. They recognized the Nicaean Creed as the church's official creedal statement. His resolution passed. Now, that's quite a turnaround from the place that he'd been years before when he felt that he stood, you'll remember, all alone against the error of Arianism, where he had said, Athanasius contra munda, Athanasius against the world. But trouble was brewing in the important city of Antioch. While the Western churches under the leadership of the Bishop of Rome remained steadfast in their loyalty to the Nicene Creed, the Eastern Empire had been leaning towards Arianism. Antioch in Syria was a key Eastern city split between the adherents of Nicaea and Arianism. The official church, that is, the one that was recognized by the emperor in Constantinople, had an Arian bishop. Bishop Paulinus led the Nicene Christians in a separate fellowship in the city. But in 360, a new bishop rose to lead the Arian church at Antioch, and he was a devoted Nicaean named Meletius. Now, this occurred right at a time when more and more Eastern bishops were coming out in favor of the Nicene Creed. These Eastern bishops supported Meletius and the Nicaeans of Antioch. And we might think that this would see a merger of the old Nicaeans under Paulinus with the new. And we would assume, wrongly, Rome and the Western Church considered Paulinus the rightful bishop of Antioch and remained suspicious of Meletius and these new Nicaeans. Efforts on their part to negotiate with and be accepted by the Western Church were rebuffed. This served to increase the divide between East and West that had been brewing for the previous decades. A new center of spiritual weight developed at this time in Cappadocia and Central Eastern Asia Minor. It formed around the careers of three able church leaders, Basil the Great, his brother Gregory of Nyssa, and their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. Their work answered the lingering concerns that hovered around the words that the Nicene Council had chosen to describe Jesus as being of the same substance as the Father. These three Cappadocian fathers were able to convince their Eastern brothers that the Nicene Creed was the best formulation they were likely to produce, and to accept that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father, and so God, not a similar substance, so something other than or less than God, as of course the Arians believed. Now, they pressed in on terms that made it clear that there was only one God, but three persons who individually are and together comprise that one God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They said that the three operated inseparably, none ever acting independently of the others. Every divine action begins from the Father, proceeds through the Son, and is completed in the Holy Spirit. In 381, at the Council of Constantinople, the Eastern Church demonstrated its acceptance of the Cappadocian Fathers' theology by affirming their adherence to the Nicene Creed. This effectively marked the end of Arianism within the empire. And unlike the three previous ecumenical councils, the Council of Constantinople was not followed by years of bitter strife. What the council failed to do was resolve the split in the church at Antioch. The West continued to support the old Nicaeans, while the East supported the new. It was clear to all that tension was building between the old seat of imperial power and the new capital, between Rome and Constantinople. Which church and bishop would be the recognized leader of the whole? Antioch became the site where that contest was lived out through their surrogates, Paulinus and Meletius. The Council of Constantinople attempted to deal with this contest by developing a system for how the churches would be led. The rulings of the council, and really all the church councils held during these years, is called canon law, which establishes policy by which the church would operate. One of the rulings of the Council of Constantinople was that from now on there would be something called dioceses. A diocese was a group of provinces that became a region over which a bishop presided. The rule was that one diocese could not interfere in the workings of another. Each was to be autonomous. Though Jovian followed Julian as emperor in 363, his reign was short. He followed a policy of religious toleration, as did Valentinian I, who succeeded him. Valentinian recognized the empire was too vast for one man to rule and appointed his younger brother Valens to rule in the east. Valens was less tolerant than his brother and attacked both paganism and Nicaean Christians. But Valens was the last Arian to rule in either east or west. All subsequent emperors were Orthodox. They followed the Nicene Creed. When Valentinian died in 375, rule of the Western Empire fell to his son Gratian. And when Valens died, Gratian chose an experienced soldier named Theodosius to rule the east. Gratian and Theodosius presided over the final demise of paganism. Both men strongly supported the Orthodox faith, and at the urging of Bishop Ambrose of Milan, they enacted policies that brought an end to pagan worship. Of course, individuals scattered throughout the empire continued to secretly offer sacrifices to idols and went through the superstitious rituals of the past. But as a social institution, with temples and a formal priesthood, paganism was eradicated. In fact, under the reign of Theodosius, Christianity was made the official religion of the empire. We move now to consider how the church at Rome emerged during the 4th and 5th centuries to become the lead church of the empire. In theory, all the bishops of the empire's many churches were equal. In reality, from the time of the Apostolic Fathers, some gained greater prominence because their churches were in what were considered more important cities. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Alexandria, Antioch, Rome, and Carthage were the places of the greatest spiritual gravity. So their senior pastors were recognized as leaders, not just of their individual churches, but of the church. The Council of Nicaea in 325 recognized Alexandria as the lead church for all of North Africa, Antioch in the east, and then Rome as being preeminent in the west. Constantinople, the new eastern political capital, was added to that list in 381 by the Council of Constantinople. As one of its rulings in canon law, the council declared Constantinople second only to Rome in terms of precedence in deciding church matters. Now, we might assume that the Bishop of Rome would gladly accept this finding of the council, being that it acknowledged the Roman see, that is the bishop's realm of authority, it's called a see, as primary. But he didn't. He objected because the council's ruling implied the position of a church and its bishop depended on the status of their city in the empire. In other words, it was the nearest to the center of political power that weighed the most. Well, the Bishop of Rome maintained that the preeminence of Rome wasn't dependent on political proximity, but on historical precedent. He said the decree of a synod or a council didn't convey primacy. The Roman bishop claimed that Rome was primary because God had made it so. At a council in Rome, a year after the Council of Constantinople, the Roman bishop Damasus said that Rome's primacy rested on, watch this, the Apostle Peter's founding of the Roman Church. Ever since the mid-3rd century, Roman Christians had used Matthew 16, Luke 22, and John 21 to claim that their church possessed a unique authority over other churches and bishops. This Petrine theory, as it's come to be known, was generally accepted by the end of the 6th century. It claimed that Peter had been given primacy over his fellow apostles, and his superior position had then been passed on from him to his successors, the bishops of Rome, by something called apostolic succession. In truth, there was already a substantial church community in Rome when Peter arrived and was martyred. The Christians honored Peter as they did all of their martyrs by marking his grave as a popular gathering place. Eventually, that became a shrine, and then when persecution ended, the shrine became a church. The leader of that church became associated with Peter, whose grave was its central feature. When Constantine came to power, he ordered a basilica built on the site on Vatican Hill. To mark that a new day of favor toward the church had come, Constantine gave the Lateran Palace, where the Roman empress had lived, to the now Bishop of Rome as his residence. But the story that arose later, which puts the Emperor Constantine on his face before Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome, pleading forgiveness in sackcloth and ashes, and handing over to him the rule of Italy and Rome, that's a complete fiction. Until Bishop Damasus in the mid-4th century, the Roman bishops were competent leaders of the church, but they tended towards weakness when dealing with emperors, who often sought to dominate the faith. A dramatic change occurred at the end of the 4th century when, under Ambrose of Milan, the church began dictating to the emperor. We'll take a look at that later. Now, Bishop Damasus, a contemporary of Ambrose, installed the primacy of Peter as a central part of church doctrine. He claimed that the Roman Church was started by Peter, who'd passed on his authority to the next bishop, who'd in turn handed it to his successor, and that each bishop of Rome was a recipient of Peter's apostolic authority. Since Peter was the leader of the apostles, the Roman Church was the lead church, and its bishop, the leader, not just of Rome, but of all Christendom. Damasus was the first to address other bishops as sons rather than brothers. Historical events during the 4th and 5th centuries enhanced the power of the Bishop of Rome. When Constantine moved the political capital to Constantinople in 330, it left the Roman bishop as the strongest individual in Rome for long stretches of time. People in the West looked to him for temporal as well as spiritual leadership when a crisis arose. Constantinople and the emperor were hundreds of miles away, weeks by travel. The Roman bishop was nearby, so people turned to him to exercise authority in meeting political and spiritual crises. In 410, when Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome, Bishop Innocent I used clever diplomacy to save the city from the torch. When the Western Empire finally fell in 476, the people of Italy looked to the Roman bishop for civil as well as religious leadership. Great leaders like Cyprian, Tertullian, and Augustine were outstanding men of the Western Church who counted themselves as being under the leadership of the Bishop of Rome. The Western Empire had also managed to stay free of the heretical challenges that had racked the East, most notably that brouhaha with Arius and his followers. This doctrinal solidarity was due in large part to the steadfast leadership of Rome's capable bishops. Another factor that contributed to Rome's rise to dominance was the decline of the other great centers. Jerusalem lost its place due to the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 2nd century. Alexandria and Antioch were overrun by the Muslims in the 6th and 7th centuries, leaving Constantinople and Rome as the centers of power. In an imperial edict in 445, the Emperor Valentinian III recognized the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome in spiritual affairs. What he enacted became canon law for all. Another great boon to the influence and prestige of the Roman bishop was the missionary work of monks that were loyal to Rome. Clovis and Augustine, not the church father, planted churches in northern France and Britain, all of them owing allegiance to Rome. But above all, the Roman Church was led by several able bishops during this time, men who overlooked really no opportunity to enhance and extend their power. For example, Leo I was bishop at Rome from 440 to 461, and by far the ablest occupant of the bishop's seat until Gregory about 150 years later. His skill earned him the title Leo the Great. Now, we're not sure when Rome's bishops began to be called pope, a title which for years had been applied to the Bishop of Alexandria. But Leo, he was the first to refer consistently to himself as pope, which is from the Latin, a child's affectionate term for papa. In 452, Leo persuaded Attila the Hun to let the city of Rome alone. And then 3 years later, when the Vandals came to sack the city, Leo convinced them to limit their loot fest to 2 weeks. The Vandal leader Guzik kept his word, and the Romans forever after esteemed Leo as the one that saved their city from destruction. Pope Leo insisted that all church courts and rulings of all bishops had to be submitted to him for final decision. This is what Valentinian III's edict in 445 granted, and he was determined to apply it. Pope Gelasius I, who ruled from 492 to 496, said that God gave sacred power to the Pope and royal power to the king. But because the Pope had to account to God for the king at the judgment, the sacred power of the Pope was more important than royal power. So civil rulers should submit to the Pope. While emperors didn't all automatically knuckle under to popes, most did resign a large part of their authority and political influence to the Roman bishops. Now we're going to round out this episode with a little fuller look at the first church historian Eusebius of Caesarea. We briefly looked at him in episode 15. His premier work was Ecclesiastical History, originally composed in 10 volumes. Eusebius began it during the Great Persecution of 303 to 313, completed it around 315. Over the next decade, he edited and revised it several times. It charted the course of primitive Christianity from obscurity in the backwater province of Israel to the favored faith of the new Emperor Constantine. Along the way, Eusebius does great service to future generations by giving careful lists of church regions and the sequence of their leaders. He quotes early Christian authors, writings that have long since been lost to us but now preserved by the pen of Eusebius. He describes the early church's labor to define and understand the Trinity as against the various heresies that sought to hijack orthodoxy. Though Eusebius began his chronicle during Diocletian's great persecution, he lived to see the faith's emergence from the catacombs during the time of Constantine, to stand on the threshold of a new world in which Christ could be envisioned as triumphant over Caesar. While Eusebius is honored today as the father of church history for his groundbreaking work, his generation knew him simply as the bishop of Caesarea and a friend of Pamphilus, a scholar who fought valiantly against the Arian heresy. Now, little really is known about Eusebius' life prior to his tenure as lead pastor at that important church of Caesarea. He seems to have been born in the Roman province of Palestine right around 260. He became a pupil of Pastor Pamphilus at Caesarea, and then his chief assistant. Pamphilus had come from Alexandria and made at Caesarea one of the greatest libraries of Christian writings. Just before Pamphilus arrived, the great scholar Origen had centered his work there and composed the famed Hexapla, a Bible in 6 side-by-side languages, the first of what would later be called parallel Bibles. The Hexapla was kept there. Though Pamphilus expanded Caesarea's library, it was really Origen who had started it with volumes that he'd collected during his many travels. Eusebius so revered his teacher that he called himself son of Pamphilus. Pamphilus was imprisoned in the last days of the great persecution, and he died in 310. Eusebius wrote a 3-volume biography of his mentor. The persecution that claimed Pamphilus continued to wreak havoc among Christians in Caesarea, and so Eusebius fled to Egypt for a few years where things were less dicey. When he returned in 313, the church elected him as their bishop. The city had a population of 100,000 people, and that's no small number for a city of that time and place. There he wrote 3 of his longest works. The first was a refutation of paganism in 15 volumes that he titled Preparation. The second was a 20-volume look at Old Testament prophecies fulfilled by Christ. He titled that The Demonstration of the Gospel. And third was something he titled The Chronicle, which was a record of world history to 303. Eusebius intended that to be a preface to his magnum opus of ecclesiastical history. A few years after Eusebius became bishop at Caesarea, the Arian Controversy broke out in full force, threatening to tear the church apart. It seemed what persecution had been unable to do during the reign of Diocletian, an argument over theology would accomplish. A student of Pamphilus, Eusebius did not support Arius' idea that Jesus wasn't God, but he would not go along with the movement to declare Arius a heretic and toss him and his many supporters out of the church. And for that, Eusebius himself was excommunicated in early 325 by an anti-Arian synod at Antioch. At the Council of Nicaea later that year, he defended himself before the emperor by bringing forth a copy of the baptismal creed used in his church at Caesarea. It stated an orthodox view and proved Eusebius was no Arian. What he was a church leader who felt the Arian controversy had been turned by some into a grievous black mark on Christian unity. He thought that it would be better to keep Arius and his many supporters in the church and deal with them as men who needed correction, better than to cast them out and see them agitate for their position, where the world would look upon all of this as just a shameful display of pettiness. The Caesarean baptismal formula was such a clear affirmation of an orthodox view that it was apparently used as the template from which the Council of Nicaea crafted its final position and developed the Nicene Creed. But some who attended the council found the Caesarean formula too vague. They sought to remedy that vagueness by adding the controversial term homoousios that we've already covered. Eusebius reluctantly voted with the rest of the council in approving the creed, though he was one of the many bishops that were less than thrilled by the inclusion of that word. Over the next months and years, controversy raged over the word homoousios, and the condemned Arius returned to favor. The tables turned, and orthodoxy seemed to go down to defeat at the hands of a resurgent heresy. And it would have too, were it not for the courageous stand of Athanasius, who refused to allow the truth of God's word to be edited by the prospect of a pragmatic church politic. Sadly, Eusebius sat on the board that then condemned Athanasius, again, not for doctrinal reasons, but because Eusebius judged Athanasius as a divisive agent who hindered unity. What Eusebius had been reluctant to do with the heretic Arius, to oust him, he was willing to do with someone who was supremely orthodox, Athanasius. It's confusing. The Emperor Constantine was impressed with Eusebius and asked him to produce a speech to be given at the 13th anniversary of the emperor's ascension. Eusebius followed that up with a grandiloquent elegy of Constantine when he died in 335. Eusebius himself died 4 years later. One of the works that Eusebius produced that has been a source of much help to historians is called the Onomasticon. It was a groundbreaking innovation on Eusebius's part. In modern terms, we'd call it a Bible atlas, a geographical gazette. His goal was to provide an easily referenced list of all the places the Bible mentions and give a short description of where they were located. He used Roman miles as a measure of distance and listed them alphabetically and by what book of the Bible they were referred to. When Eusebius was an assistant to his mentor Pamphilus, they worked on the challenge of textual criticism with the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, as well as manuscripts of the New Testament. And Jerome tells us that Origen had already collected the Septuagint, and that was the text that Pamphilus and Eusebius worked on. Eusebius also set about to produce a kind of harmony of the four Gospels so that people could read the story of Jesus in a collected format. This work was a favorite text of medieval scholars and became the source of many illuminated manuscripts. And besides these major works of Eusebius is a plethora of shorter and lesser works, letters, short treatises, notes, and all bearing his distinctive mark. Eusebius is recognized by no one as an author of great prose or eloquence. His writing is classically workmanlike. What distinguishes his style, in everything except his praise of Constantine, is its refusal to embellish or fabricate. Not everything he wrote was factual, but whatever he did pen was carefully and faithfully transmitted from what he'd been told or had researched. And for that reason, scholars tend to give Eusebius general credence in his recording of history.